The year was 1798, and the wilds of Kentucky still held more mystery than order. It was a time when the line between civilization and chaos was razor thin, where the law had no strong roots, and people lived off instinct, grit, and whispers carried on the wind. Among the scattered settlements and remote cabins that dotted the forested hills and blood-soaked frontier roads, one family quietly built a reputation, not for kindness, not for faith, not even for prosperity, but for secrecy. The Bouchards had arrived from New England 2 years prior, bringing with them 3 wagons, 7 cattle, and an air of strangeness that no one could quite put their finger on. They chose their land with peculiar care, settling deep in the woods where no other family dared live. The farm was built fast and broad with surprising precision and unnatural quiet. Barns rose within weeks. Fences sprang up around the property, and the cabin, larger than most in those parts, looked more like a lodge meant for gatherings than a humble home. Locals tried to welcome them with customary offerings, salt, meat, and spare tools. But the Bouchards accepted these gifts with stiff politeness and gave little in return but thin smiles and cold stares. From the start, something felt wrong. People said the Bouchard children never laughed or played. The mother, Emmeline, was rarely seen outside, and when she was, her hands were always stained with something she wouldn't explain. The father, Laurent Bouchard, stood over 6 feet tall and carried a carved walking stick. Even though he limped on neither leg, his voice was soft and articulate, which made the things he said land even harder. He once told a preacher who warned of hellfire, "Sir, if you've not met it, you're not speaking from experience." Travelers began to avoid the narrow trail near their property, though no one spoke aloud as to why. Some said it was the eerie howling that echoed from the forest at night, long, low, and wrong. Others said they passed near the farm and saw strange symbols carved into the trees or birds nailed to the posts of the Bouchards' cornfield. Those who did pass through were often peddlers, fur traders, or immigrants, too new to the region to know better. The unlucky ones never made it to the next town. The early settlers chalked it up to nature. Wolves, Injuns, bandits. But the numbers didn't lie. From 1796 to 1798, more than 15 travelers vanished along the road that curled around the Bouchard land like a snake. Their wagons were sometimes found stripped clean or still packed and abandoned. Horses ran free, or worse, were found dead with their eyes removed. A few bodies turned up in ravines or creek beds, but most never did. And if the farm was ever searched, no record of it remained. The Bouchards thrived. Their crops grew taller than any other. Their livestock never got sick. They had goods to trade and food to spare, though no one ever saw them in town long enough to speak with. Emmeline sold preserves at market once, a blood-colored jelly that no one could name but everyone remembered. She said it was an old family recipe. No one asked for seconds. Still, no one wanted to believe the worst. This was the frontier. People disappeared. But fear began to take root like mold under the floorboards. It spread in the way men lowered their voices when speaking of the Bouchards, in the way mothers kept their children close on market days, and in the silence that followed every new disappearance. There was something else, too, something unspoken. The land itself seemed complicit. Birds didn't sing near the Bouchard farm. The grass was dark, almost blue in patches. A hunter once claimed he saw the ground ripple like it was breathing. Disappearances, once rare and easily blamed on the chaos of frontier life, became more frequent. At first, it was easy enough to explain away. A fur trapper gone missing? Perhaps he tangled with a bear. A preacher not seen since heading west. Maybe he found another settlement, or took ill on the road. The wilderness, after all, was no place for the soft or the unlucky. But the pattern couldn't be ignored forever. The road that cut through the eastern hills, the one that passed near the Bouchard property, became known among traders as the Devil's Bend. It was a narrow, winding path that cut through thick forest and dipped into fog-shrouded hollows. And somewhere along that road, people vanished. Not in the dozens at once, but one by one, slowly, methodically, like the land itself was picking them off. Travelers would be seen passing through nearby towns speaking of their destination, of the next county or river port. Then they would never arrive. Their names would echo in taverns and churchyards, their fates reduced to nervous speculation. Sometimes pieces of their stories trickled in. A splintered wagon found in the trees, a hat, a coat, a bloodied boot, but never the full picture. One young man, Elijah Crane, was different. He had grit, and more importantly, he had family willing to search for him. When Elijah failed to return from his trading route, his cousin Silas rode the trail himself, retracing every mile. He didn't return either, but weeks later, a trapper found Silas barely alive in the forest, sunburnt, delirious, and bleeding from deep gashes on his back. His tale, half whispered through cracked lips, sent chills through every listener. He spoke of being taken in by a kind family after his horse turned up lame. They welcomed him into their home, gave him food, drink, even a bed for the night. But something was wrong. He awoke not in the cabin, but beneath it, in what he described as a stone cellar, windowless, with rusted chains bolted to the floor. He ran barefoot for miles until he collapsed. That was all he could say before fever took his mind. The authorities were summoned. A few brave men from town rode toward the Bouchard homestead. But when they returned, they claimed to find nothing. No cellar, no signs of blood, just a quiet family running a well-kept farm. The sheriff dismissed Silas's claims as hallucinations from fever and trauma. Most people nodded in agreement, but their eyes told another story. The silence from the law only fed the rumors. Some began to say the Bouchard were protected, either by money, fear, or darker things. One woman swore she saw the sheriff's wife wearing a necklace identical to the one her missing sister used to wear. Another man claimed he'd been paid to stay quiet after finding personal belongings in a dry creek bed near the Bouchard land, items he later couldn't locate again when he brought others to see. And yet, more people vanished. The Bouchards continued on as always, their farm untouched by suspicion, their smiles unchanged. But the name Bouchard began to carry weight. Not openly, not in public, but behind closed doors. Mothers warned their sons. Peddlers avoided the road. Even other farmers moved their boundaries away, letting fences fall where their land met the Bouchards. Everyone knew. No one acted. Fear, after all, is a quiet and patient thing. The woods kept their secrets, for now. The Bouchard family was far more than just a group of reclusive farmers tucked away in the Kentucky backwoods of 1798. They were devotees of an ancient, blood-soaked belief that had followed them across the Atlantic generations earlier. Behind the weather-worn facade of their farmhouse and the creaky hospitality of their hearth, they practiced rituals so old and vile that even the native soil seemed reluctant to absorb the blood they spilled. It wasn't just murder. It was doctrine, discipline, and devotion. And every member of the Bouchard family had a role to play. Elias Bouchard, the father and patriarch, was the keeper of the old ways. He carried the family's ancestral book, its pages written in a strange dialect of Old French and something darker, less human. Bound in stitched leather, possibly human, it was filled with rituals for harnessing the power of sacrifice to appease a giver of bounty they called Le Man Rouge. Elias believed that the land they now farmed, a stretch of soil near the Red River, responded to blood like it did to rain. He had seen it firsthand. Crops that grew twice as tall, animals that bred more vigorously, even a kind of unnatural warmth that kept the soil fertile beyond its season. His wife Marianne played the role of the priestess in their terrible rites. Soft-spoken and pale, she prepared the victims with an eerie grace, as if baking a pie or sewing a quilt. She would clean them in spring water before the rituals, anoint them with ground bone and ash, and murmur over them the words handed down in the family's bloodline. She would cook their flesh afterwards, sometimes to dispose of it, other times to serve it to unwitting guests under the guise of stew or sausage. Marianne believed this act bound the victims to the land eternally, their essence worked back into the earth. Their eldest son, Julian, had a way with people. Tall, striking, and capable of masking his unnatural upbringing with charm, he was the bait. He would ride out to nearby towns, often posing as a trader or messenger, and lure in travelers, drifters, or merchants with promises of cheap lodging or a shortcut across the ridge. Women, in particular, found him trustworthy. Men saw him as harmless. When he brought them back to the farm, they were given warm beds and warm food. Just before, they were shackled in the cellar beneath the barn, a place where the walls sweated and the air never moved. The younger children, twins Abel and Lizette, were raised not only to accept the killings, but to view them as sacred acts. They played near graves like other children played near creeks, and their chores included gathering herbs for poultices and draining blood from barrels. Their innocence had been stolen early, replaced with wide-eyed reverence for the family's cause. They asked no questions. They laughed during the chants, and when the time came, they helped hold down limbs. Below the barn lay the center of it all, a carved stone table brought over piece by piece from the old country and reassembled beneath the Kentucky earth. The table had grooves to carry blood and markings that predated Christianity by centuries. Here, under the flickering light of tallow candles, Elias would raise the family's curved sacrificial blade and perform the ritual with unwavering calm. Victims rarely died quickly. The process required slowness, precision, and a recitation that lasted for minutes. When it ended, the room was left in silence, save for the gurgling of blood through the stone channels. It was never random. The Bouchard believed certain kinds of blood brought different boons. Soldiers gave strength. Virgins gave purity to the soil. Men of faith, if they could be tricked into the ritual, made the corn grow tallest. The family kept a hidden ledger bound in twine that cataloged the kills, name, type, result. If a ritual yielded good crops or healthier cattle, the victim's bloodline would be noted and, if possible, sought out again. They were systematic, efficient, religious. The people of the nearby settlements knew something was wrong with that farm. They smelled it in the air on some mornings. When the wind blew down from the ridge, they saw the glint in Julian's eyes when he smiled. But nothing concrete ever stuck, not with the sheriff in Elias's pocket, and the community too afraid to dig deeper. No one wanted to believe what they might find. But the land knew. The forest edge had gone quiet. Animals avoided the paths near the farm, and the soil, so fertile for so long, had begun to change. It pulsed after every ritual now as if something beneath it stirred. The Bouchards took it as a sign their god was awakening, but others would soon see it as a sign that their time was running out. As whispers of missing travelers echoed through the hills of frontier Kentucky, some settlers began to suspect the disappearances weren't just bad luck or the harsh reality of untamed wilderness. A few dared to speak up. Neighbors who had seen too much, who remembered the peddler who never came back from the Bouchard's farm, or the preacher's boy who vanished on his way to deliver a letter. But those whispers always seemed to die out, either silenced by fear or by something much darker. The Bouchard family wasn't just another farming clan. Their roots went deep, not only in the soil, but in the veins of local power. At the time, law enforcement in rural Kentucky was scattered and unreliable, more influenced by personal debts, favors, and handshakes than any formal justice system. Sheriff Aldous Green had held his post longer than anyone remembered, and though he presented himself as a pious, firm-handed man, the truth was more complicated. He owed the Bouchard not just money from card games and horse trades, but darker debts. Rumor had it that they helped cover up something from Green's past, an accidental shooting, or maybe worse. In return, he turned a blind eye to their business. Whenever a report came in about a missing person, last seen heading west, past the Bouchard farm, Green filed it away, said the person likely got lost or eaten by wolves. If a body washed up downstream, torn and half buried in mud, it was chalked up to bandits or Indians. Neighbors who questioned the official story often found their own lives unraveling in terrifying ways. The Tanner family, who once accused the Bouchards of poisoning their livestock, lost their youngest daughter within a week. She went missing during a rainstorm and was never found. Their well turned black not long after, the water slick with oil and stinking of rot. They left town by the end of that summer, never to return. Another man, Elijah Rowe, began telling folks he had followed a blood trail near the Bouchard smokehouse. He spoke of strange markings carved into the bark of nearby trees and claimed to have seen movement in the cornfield at night, shapes that didn't walk quite right. He was found weeks later with a broken neck at the bottom of a ravine. Sheriff Green called it a hunting accident, though no one could explain how he'd ended up in that part of the woods with his rifle still hanging on his porch. The Bouchards themselves maintained a chilling calm. They showed up at church some Sundays, dressed in black, heads bowed, speaking little. People noticed how none of the children in town ever played near them, how the dogs would whine and pull away if the family passed by. The mother, Celeste, was always polite, always smiling, but her eyes were flat. Dead, some said, like a doll's. She sold preserves at the market, and people still bought them, though few ever ate them. Fear does strange things to a community. It makes people pretend not to see. Over time, the farm became surrounded by stories. A place people didn't go, a road people didn't travel at night. But no one dared call it what it was, not out loud, not until a stranger came. One with no debts, no history, no fear of old alliances. He started asking questions. The Bouchard didn't like that. Sheriff Green didn't either. But something had shifted. An unspoken understanding that had kept the community quiet for years began to crack. The cover-ups, the warnings, the accidents, they had built a wall of silence. But walls rot from the inside, especially when built on blood. And as the days grew shorter and the shadows on the Bouchard farm stretched longer, more eyes began to turn toward that cursed stretch of land, and more tongues began to loosen. Because when the price of silence becomes too steep, even the most frightened hearts may rise. He came to Kentucky not looking for trouble, only for the brother he hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Josiah McKenna was a hardened man, scarred by war, wearied by the long trek from Virginia, but still clung to the hope that Elias had simply lost his way, taken up with a woman, or found work too far out for regular letters. Josiah had seen the worst of men along the frontier, but he hadn't yet imagined a place like the Bouchard farm. Elias's last known correspondence had mentioned a stretch of fertile land near Green River where he intended to stay the night and possibly work. The description of the property matched a farm owned by the Bouchards, respectable on the surface, with a good reputation for their crops and hospitality. Too good, perhaps. When Josiah arrived, the farm was quiet, almost too quiet. The main house was painted clean, the windows curtained, and the fields in suspiciously full bloom given the time of year. The Bouchard welcomed him with practiced warmth, claiming they'd never seen Elias but invited him in for stew all the same. Something in their eyes made Josiah decline. He made camp by the tree line that night, claiming fatigue, though he stayed awake with his hand on his pistol. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the ground, in the unnatural silence of the surrounding woods, and in the way the dogs wouldn't bark. Around midnight, he crept from his camp and found his way toward the barn. The doors weren't locked. Inside, and a sickly, sweet stench hit him first. Then he saw it, the floorboards stained in rust-brown streaks, dried thick like paint, and tools hanging neatly on the walls that were not meant for wood or leather. He stepped deeper, past piles of feed and crates, until he found a trap door beneath a haystack. It groaned when opened, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Josiah didn't hesitate. He descended with only the light of a small lantern he'd brought, and what he found below stole the breath from his lungs. Cells. Actual cells carved out of the earth and reinforced with wood. Shackles bolted to stone. And bones. Piles of bones. Some chewed, some snapped, some still clothed in the rags of travelers. In one corner he found a bloody ledger listing names, dates, and what appeared to be rituals. And then, in the corner of the final cell, he found Elias's belt buckle, his initials still etched into the brass. That was all he needed. He rode to the nearest town at dawn, but the sheriff only narrowed his eyes and offered a thin smile. The Bouchards are upstanding folk. Been here longer than most. You sure you ain't imagining things, son? Josiah recognized the tone. The sheriff had been paid, or worse, he was complicit. If justice was to be done, Josiah would have to find it himself. He left town quietly and traveled south, seeking help from those who didn't rely on the county for protection. In a backwoods settlement, he found Reuben, an escaped freedman who had once worked near the Bouchard land and spoke of strange screams and smoke from the hills. Reuben had lost kin to the farm, though no one had believed him. Together they sought out Nita, a half-Cherokee scout known for tracking the untrackable. She didn't ask questions when Josiah showed her the buckle. She only said, "We burn it to the ground." Over several nights they watched the farm from a ridge, noting when the family left, how many returned, and when the barn lights flickered long after sunset. They heard the muffled cries from the cellar, confirming that someone else was still alive down there. It wasn't justice they sought anymore. It was retribution. When they struck, it was swift and unrelenting. The Bouchards fought like demons, the mother shrieking in tongues, the son wielding a butcher's axe, and the father whispering incantations as he bled from a bullet wound that should have dropped him. Josiah ended it himself, planting Elias's buckle on the patriarch's chest before the fire took the rest. In the ashes, they found two survivors chained in the cellar, barely conscious, eyes wide with unspeakable memories. Josiah helped them out into the dawn. Some evils hide behind smiles and good land. Some homes are built on bones, and some stories should never be forgotten. The farm had burned for hours. Flames rose high into the night sky, casting long, jagged shadows over the Kentucky hills. The barn went first. Dry timber, soaked in old blood, caught fire like paper. Then the farmhouse followed, groaning and cracking as the roof collapsed inward. The smoke stank of ash, rot, and something far fouler, something human. It was over, or it should have been. Elijah hadn't meant for it to end like this. He had come for his brother, Micah, nothing more. Just to find out what had happened to him after he stopped to rest at the Bouchard farm 2 weeks back. Elijah had ridden hard from the south, following rumors that travelers were vanishing without trace between Millersburg and the Licking River. Nobody wanted to talk at first. Eyes turned downward, lips tightened. But a pattern was there for anyone willing to see it. Always the same road, always near the same property, and always ending in silence. He had approached the Bouchard farm in broad daylight, disarmed, under the guise of a hungry traveler. That's when he met them, Eustace Bouchard, the patriarch, weathered and smiling, Clarabelle, his silent, cold-eyed wife, and their boy, Emmett, a grinning thing with something feral behind his teeth. They welcomed him with too much warmth, led him to the dinner table, asked far too many questions about whether anyone was expecting him and if he'd told anyone where he was going. Elijah hadn't stayed the night. He'd slipped from the house and into the woods after spotting a pile of boots behind the smokehouse, dozens caked in dried mud and blood. That's when he found the cellar. Hidden beneath a false floor in the barn, it stank of metal and decay. There were hooks, chains, bones stacked in corners like firewood, a child's doll soaked in dried brown, and Micah's coat, still buttoned, torn at the collar, folded too neatly on a blood-stained bench. The confirmation nearly broke him. By then the others had joined him. Josiah, the freedman with a preacher's soul and a sharpshooter's eye, had once escaped a death camp in Georgia. He had known evil before. And Nancy, the Cherokee tracker with half her face burned from a raid years earlier, said she had seen what the land looked like when it drank too much blood. It remembers, she warned. The ground here is wrong. They surrounded the farm that night. Clarabelle was the first to die, rushing Josiah with a butcher knife, whispering prayers to something no god had ever claimed. Emmett fled screaming into the woods, only to trip one of Nancy's snares. They caught him trying to chew through the leather ropes. Eustace didn't run. He stood calmly in the doorway of his burning house and told them they were too late, that the land had been fed for generations, and it would always be hungry, that the farm had belonged to something deeper than family. When they opened the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, they found the final secret. A journal, brittle with age, written by an ancestor who had come from Salem after the trials. It spoke of blood rights, of binding the land to the family, and included hand-drawn diagrams of human sacrifice. There were names recorded, rows of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, each followed by a date and a symbol. The well out back was deeper than it needed to be, too deep for the time. Josiah climbed down with a rope and lantern and came back up white-faced and shaking. "Skulls," he whispered. "God, there's so many of them. Children, too." By morning, the place was ash. They had buried what they could, burned what they couldn't. But the land remained quiet and still. And as Elijah turned to leave, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching. A child, barefoot and pale, with Emmett's smile. He blinked, and it was gone. The killings stopped after that, for a time. But years later, when another family tried to settle that same plot of land, the whispers started again. Strange screams at night, livestock gutted and arranged in circles. A child who claimed she saw a boy with no eyes leading her to the well. Some places remember, and some hungers never die.